Was a man's life truly worth a book's promise? Could a king's uncle be branded a traitor with a single, sealed letter? And could a desperate plea for mercy unravel a carefully constructed web of deceit, leading to a horrifying spectacle of justice, or something far darker? The rain hammered against the stone walls of Windsor Castle, mirroring the frantic rhythm of Edward II's heart. It wasn't the weather that chilled him to the bone, though. It was the knowledge delivered with chilling precision by his loyal, yet utterly ruthless, advisor, Roger de Mowbray, that he was surrounded by vipers. Not literal ones, of course, though some might argue the situation felt remarkably serpentine, but men, powerful men, draped in velvet and piety, who had sworn allegiance to him, to the crown, and to a horrifying, unspoken plan. A plan that involved the death of his own uncle, the Earl of Kent. It hadn't started with a grand conspiracy, not initially. It began with a letter, a single, elegantly sealed parchment bearing the Earl's seal. A letter detailing a desperate, almost ludicrous proposition, a clandestine mission to rescue Edward's deceased brother, the late King Edward I, and restore him to the throne. The letter, penned by Kent himself, outlined a scheme to bring the worshipful knight back to life, to govern as he once had, to impair the state of Edward's reign. A ludicrous proposition, yes, but one that contained a seed of truth, a dangerous whisper of discontent. Roger, a man sculpted from granite and ambition, had seized upon this letter with a predatory gleam in his eyes. He hadn't dismissed it as madness, he dissected it, analyzed it, and weaponized it. He'd summoned the court, a glittering assembly of prelates, earls, and barons, each draped in the trappings of power and riddled with their own ambitions and grievances. He'd presented the letter as undeniable proof of treason, a deliberate attempt to undermine the monarchy. And then, with a chillingly calculated flourish, he demanded Kent's immediate arrest. The court erupted. Accusations flew like poisoned darts. The prelates, their faces etched with righteous indignation, thundered about the sanctity of the crown. The earls, ever pragmatic, debated the implications of Kent's betrayal. But Roger remained impassive, a statue of cold authority, his gaze unwavering. He'd orchestrated this entire scene with masterful precision, turning Kent's desperate plea into a weapon of mass destruction. The will of this court is that you shall lose both life and limb, and that your heirs shall be disinherited forevermore, save the grace of our Lord the King. The silence that followed was thicker than the rain outside. It wasn't a polite silence, a respectful pause. It was a silence of horrified disbelief, of primal fear. Kent, a man who had once known exile and hardship, stared at Roger with a dawning comprehension of the abyss into which he had fallen. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't foreseen the ruthless efficiency of his adversary. The sentence was swift, brutal, and utterly unprecedented. The court, initially divided, quickly coalesced around Roger's judgment. The execution of a nobleman for attempting to restore a deceased king. It was an anomaly, a violation of centuries of tradition. But Roger, with his uncanny ability to manipulate events and exploit weaknesses, had ensured that the anomaly became the norm. The final confession, extracted under duress, was a masterpiece of manufactured guilt. Kent, driven to the brink of despair, admitted to receiving instructions from the Pope to liberate Edward II from prison. He confessed to a promise of funding, to a network of conspirators, a dizzying array of prelates, earls, and even a Scottish Earl, all united in their desire to overthrow the king. The Archbishop of York, Sir Ingelram de Berenger, Sir William de la Zouch, and a surprisingly named Lady Vesci, each pledged their allegiance, each offered their resources. The details were ludicrous, bordering on the fantastical: a devil summoned to deliver the king's corpse, a papal mandate, a desperate gamble fueled by ambition and resentment. But it worked. The court, swayed by the sheer volume of confessions, embraced the narrative of treason with unsettling enthusiasm. Kent, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his family, was condemned to die. The execution itself was a grotesque spectacle. The day before his death, Kent, a man of noble bearing, offered a final, heartbreaking plea for mercy. He admitted his wrongdoing, acknowledged his betrayal of the king, and promised to endure any punishment, even walking barefoot through the streets of Winchester or London, tied to a rope around his neck. He was a broken man, consumed by despair and regret, utterly oblivious to the fact that his act of desperate loyalty, his attempt to rescue his brother, had sealed his fate. Roger, unmoved by Kent's pleas, demanded the immediate execution. The executioner, a man named Thomas, refused. He was a simple laborer, a man with a family to feed, and he couldn't bring himself to spill the blood of a nobleman, even a traitor. But Roger, ever vigilant, offered a chilling incentive, the life of the executioner in exchange for his grim duty. A latrine cleaner, a man whose existence was typically hidden from the eyes of the powerful, was forced to wield the axe. The crowd, a seething mass of onlookers, watched in stunned silence as the Earl of Kent's head was severed from his body. The shout of "Behold the head of a traitor" echoed through the square, a chilling testament to the brutal efficiency of Roger's justice. But the story didn't end there. The execution of Kent unleashed a torrent of accusations, a whirlwind of paranoia and suspicion. Roger, emboldened by his victory, began to systematically dismantle the opposition. 40 men named in Kent's confession were arrested and proscribed, their lives forfeit. The Archbishop of York, Sir Ingelram de Berenger, and Sir William de la Zouch were implicated, their reputations tarnished, their influence diminished. A string of prominent figures, Sir Fulk Fitzwarren, Sir John Peck, Sir Henry de Beaumont, Sir Thomas Rosslyn, the Scottish Earl of Mar, were dragged into the web of accusations, each accused of aiding and abetting Kent's treasonous plot. The accusations spiraled outwards, encompassing Dominican friars who had allegedly informed Kent of Edward II's existence, and even Lady Vesky, a noblewoman whose involvement remained shrouded in mystery. The list of suspects grew longer with each passing day, fueled by Roger's relentless pursuit of enemies and his willingness to fabricate evidence. As the arrests mounted, the court descended into chaos. Parliament, scheduled to convene in mid-October, was effectively paralyzed. The Lords, terrified by Roger's power and the specter of execution, were unwilling to engage in any meaningful debate. Edward II, a king weakened by illness and surrounded by enemies, found himself increasingly isolated, his authority undermined by the machinations of his advisors. Roger, however, was not content with simply silencing his critics. He embarked on a campaign of unprecedented financial exploitation, demanding vast sums of money from the clergy and the common folk. He justified his demands with claims of defending Gascony, of preparing for a potential invasion, of securing England from foreign threats. But the money, it quickly became apparent, was not being used for defense. It was being siphoned off into Roger's own coffers, fueling his ambitions and consolidating his power. The Pope, alerted to the escalating crisis, reluctantly granted an ecclesiastical grant, providing a much-needed influx of funds. But even this assistance was not enough to satisfy Roger's insatiable appetite for wealth. He demanded personal grants, lavish rewards for his loyal supporters, and the confiscation of estates forfeited by those who had fallen afoul of his wrath. The royal treasury, already depleted by years of mismanagement and extravagant spending, was rapidly emptying under Roger's relentless demands. The king, desperate to maintain his authority, reluctantly acquiesced, authorizing the transfer of vast sums of money to Roger's control. But Roger's ambition extended beyond mere financial gain. He sought to consolidate his power, to transform himself from a trusted advisor into a de facto ruler. He granted himself titles, estates, and privileges that bordered on the absurd, rewarding his loyal followers and punishing his enemies with ruthless efficiency. He disinherited his own cousins, seized the lands of his rivals, and appointed his sons to key positions throughout the kingdom. The atmosphere in England became increasingly oppressive, dominated by fear and suspicion. Commissioners were dispatched to every corner of the realm, tasked with identifying and arresting political opponents. The countryside was swept by a wave of violence and intimidation, as Roger's agents ruthlessly suppressed dissent and enforced his will. As Roger's power grew, so too did the threat of rebellion. A network of exiles driven from England by his tyranny began to plot a daring invasion, seeking to restore Edward II to the throne and overthrow Roger's regime. The Scottish Earl of Mar, Sir Thomas Rosslyn, and others, fueled by a thirst for revenge and a desire to reclaim their lost lands, gathered forces in the north, preparing to strike at the heart of England. But Roger, ever vigilant, anticipated their plans. He mobilized the army, fortified the borders, and unleashed a wave of repression, crushing any sign of resistance. The court, paralyzed by fear, remained silent, unable to challenge Roger's authority. Edward II, trapped in a web of his own making, watched helplessly as his kingdom descended into chaos. He realized with growing horror that he had unleashed a force he could no longer control, a force that threatened to consume him and everything he held dear. The final act of Roger's tyranny unfolded in the spring of 1330. He ordered the arrest of the Earl of Kent's pregnant wife and children, a cruel and calculated move designed to further intimidate the opposition. He locked them away in a dungeon, effectively condemning them to a slow and agonizing death. And then, in a final, breathtaking act of cruelty, he ordered the execution of the Earl of Kent's 13-year-old son, Edmund. The boy, a bright and promising young man, was publicly beheaded in the marketplace, a gruesome reminder of Roger's absolute power. As the sun set on the day of Edmund's execution, a chilling realization dawned on the court. Roger was not merely a ruler, he was a tyrant, a man consumed by ambition and driven by a lust for power. He had sacrificed everything, his honor, his conscience, and the lives of countless innocent people in his relentless pursuit of domination. Edward II, witnessing this spectacle of brutality, knew that he could no longer tolerate Roger's rule. He had to act, and he had to act decisively. But how could he challenge a man who controlled the king, who commanded the army, and who had effectively silenced all opposition? The answer, it seemed, lay in the hands of his loyal friend, Sir William de Montagu. Montagu, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty, began to carefully cultivate a following among the lords and prelates, patiently chipping away at Roger's power base. As the autumn approached, the stage was set for a final confrontation. The court, sensing the impending storm, began to shift its allegiance. The lords, emboldened by Montagu's leadership, prepared to challenge Roger's authority. But Roger, alerted to the brewing rebellion, responded with swift and brutal force. He arrested Thomas Wake, a prominent baron who had dared to defy him, and ordered his immediate execution. The final act of Roger's reign was a desperate attempt to consolidate his power, to crush any remaining opposition before it could gain momentum. But it was too late, the tide had turned. On March 19, 1330, the Earl of Kent was led to the block and beheaded. His death was a watershed moment, a symbol of Roger's tyranny and the beginning of the end of his reign. The court, horrified by the spectacle of Kent's execution, erupted in outrage. The lords, emboldened by the Earl's death, resolved to remove Roger from power. But as they prepared to act, Roger, sensing the shift in the balance of power, launched a final, desperate attempt to maintain his control. He ordered the arrest of 40 men, including Sir Ingelram de Berenger, Sir William de la Zouch, and Sir Fulk Fitzwarren, all of whom had been implicated in Kent's treasonous plot. He confiscated their estates, stripped them of their titles, and banished them from the kingdom, but it was too late, the damage was done. The lords, united in their determination to overthrow Roger, moved swiftly to seize control of the government. On April 20th, Roger, realizing that his fate was sealed, ordered that he be pardoned all his own and all his ancestors' debts at the Exchequer. 2 days later, he arranged that a certain John Gales, in return for his service to Roger, should be allowed to keep a manor which he held from Queen Philippa, even after her death. The royal purse was now publicly rewarding men for service to Roger. As the sun set on his 43rd birthday, Roger, surrounded by his loyal followers, celebrated with a whole string of grants. To himself, he gave the lordship of the manor of Droitwich and custody of the castle of Athlone in Ireland. To himself and Joan, he granted palatinate rights in Meath. To his son Sir Geoffrey, who had obviously been forgiven for his earlier outburst, he granted the lordship of Donnington Castle, as well as other lands forfeited by the Earl of Kent in Leicestershire, Gloucestershire, Surrey, Lincolnshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Rutland, and Wiltshire. In May, he granted himself an extra 500 marks £333 annually, in addition to his usual salary for governing Wales. In June, he granted himself an extra 500 marks in return for his continued attendance on the king, as well as the lordship of the manor of Westhall and the town of Fulbrook. A few days later, he extended his control of the Pembroke wardship. The list goes on and on. In August, he received Clifford Castle, the manor of Glassbury, the custody of the manor of Gormanstown, and a grant of all the goods and chattels of the Earls of Arundel and Hugh Despencer in the Marches of Wales, which had escheated to the king. This last grant especially was an example of Roger interpreting his earldom of March in the widest possible sense, claiming authority over a vast area and appropriating the huge wealth of the Despensers, which had supposedly been surrendered to the government, rather than to him personally. But it was no use. The lords, led by Montagu, had already secured the support of Edward II. And as the sun rose on April 21st, Roger de Mowbray was arrested and imprisoned. The reign of terror was over. But the legacy of Roger's tyranny would linger for generations, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of power. And so, as the rain continued to fall on Windsor Castle, the question remains, could a man's life truly be bought with a book's promise? And in the face of such brutal injustice, what responsibility did the powerful bear to protect the vulnerable?